CSS is not a perfect technology. It's extremely useful. It does have limitations, so it's a good idea as we go into learning about CSS that we have an idea coming in what its limitations are, and we can keep that in mind and think about that as we discuss the language and its implementation. One of the biggest limitations of CSS is its inconsistent browser support. Some browsers support a lot of CSS, some browsers have holes in their implementation, and obviously there are some browsers that support little or no CSS. You need to keep this in mind when you're using any web technology, and particularly in the case of HTML and CSS, that whatever it is that you design and however it is that it looks on your world-class browser that you do your design work on, be it Firefox or Safari or Internet Explorer, there's going to be a number of visitors to your website who will be using other technology, more limited technology, and will not see the page laid out the way that you intended for them to see it. And so what you need to do is you need to keep this in mind, and we will as we go through the various subjects that we're going to cover in our coverage of CSS, and make sure that you have some idea of what it is that your visitors are going to see who have limited or sometimes no support for CSS. CSS has a confusing positioning model. I've done an entire title on CSS positioning because of this, because people come to me and they say, well, how do I position columns? How do I do this or that? CSS is not actually a layout language. It's not designed for layout. And so things like positioning tend to be confusing. And then there's the fact that they just name some of the properties things that don't mean what they would mean in Earth language. For example, positioning relative. The relative positioning is not at all about positioning things relative to a fixed point. It's about establishing that fixed point so that absolute positioning later works relative to that point that you established. And this is not obvious when you look at the language. So we'll go into some of the details of these, and I have a separate title on lynda.com specifically about CSS positioning, which goes into it in even more detail. CSS oftentimes uses properties with different names for the same purposes. They usually don't interact well. Mixing them can be confusing. It requires a good fundamental understanding in order to choose one model and stick with it. So it's important to know that there are overlapping property definitions and to make sure that you keep them straight and use them in a consistent way so that at the end of the day, your page works the way that you expect it to. Finally, there's no simple layout model. Again, CSS is not a layout language. It's a style language. It's commonly used for layout because there's a need for this and they've put some layout features in it, but it's kludgy at best. For example, common need to lay out columns on a web page, but there's no coherent columns model in CSS. You have to create columns using positioning, either absolute positioning or float positioning, and it doesn't always work perfectly. And it's not intuitive, and it's prone to problems. So as we go through the language of CSS, keep in mind that it has these limitations. And just understand that they're there and understand that we'll be working around some of them, and the whole journey will be a lot less painful.